Racist cops thought they could get away with harassing an elderly black man, until he made one phone call that turned their world upside down. What happened next sent shockwaves through the entire police force, and it was all caught on camera. The hum of the engine was the only sound in the car as Mr. Elijah Carter drove down the quiet suburban street, his mind on nothing more than getting home and putting his feet up. It was his weekly grocery run, a ritual that had become second nature. Bags of fresh fruit and vegetables sat neatly in the passenger seat, a loaf of bread tucked securely beside them. Then, the flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Elijah felt a familiar pang in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but something close to it. He knew he had done nothing wrong. He had not run a light, had not been speeding. His registration and insurance were up to date. Yet still, he signaled and pulled over to the curb, his movements calm and deliberate. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Through the side mirror, he watched as two officers approached his car, Deputy Carter and Officer Blake. Both were white, both young, their faces unreadable behind the harsh glare of the patrol car's headlights. Their movements were brisk, aggressive. Something was off. Then, before Elijah could even roll down his window, "Step out of the vehicle!" one of them barked. Elijah frowned, his heartbeat quickening. "Excuse me, officer, may I ask what this is about?" he asked, his voice even, controlled. There was no answer, only the sharp click of a flashlight being flicked on and aimed directly into his eyes. "I said step out. Now." He sighed and reached for the door handle, moving carefully. This was not his first time dealing with officers like these. He had spent decades defending people from them. And now, at 78 years old, he was standing on the side of the road, under the cold glow of streetlights, being treated like a criminal. Before he could fully straighten, a rough hand grabbed his arm. "Hey," he started, but they were already pulling him out. His feet scraped against the curb, his balance unsteady. His grocery bag slipped from the seat and tumbled onto the pavement. A bag of oranges spilled, rolling aimlessly into the street. "You look suspicious, old man," sneered Officer Blake as he tightened his grip. "What are you doing out here this late?" Elijah's jaw clenched. He exhaled slowly through his nose. It was 7:45 p.m. Not exactly late. "I was heading home. From the store," he said, nodding toward the scattered groceries. "Do I need to explain that?" Neither officer responded. Instead, they started patting him down. Their hands rifled through his pockets. Then, without warning, Deputy Carter yanked open the car door and began searching through his front seat. He knocked over the bread, flipped through his glove compartment. He was looking for something. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. They had no cause for this. No right. A few cars slowed as they passed. Someone was standing on the sidewalk now, phone raised, recording. Still, the officers carried on. Then, a smirk from Officer Blake. A whisper, just low enough for only Elijah to hear. "No one's going to believe an old black man over two cops," and that was when Elijah knew. This was not just a traffic stop. This was an intimidation tactic, a power play. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Elijah Carter was not just any old man. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached into his pocket. The officers tensed, their hands twitching toward their weapons. But Elijah did not pull out a gun. He pulled out his phone. He pressed a single contact and brought the device to his ear. His voice was steady, unshaken. "I need you to come down here," he said simply. "Now." There was silence. Then, laughter. "Calling your grandson?" mocked Deputy Carter. But Elijah Carter was not calling his grandson. He was calling the one person these officers should have feared the most. Elijah Carter was no stranger to moments like this. He had spent his entire life fighting against them. As a young man in the 1960s, he marched alongside civil rights leaders, facing down fire hoses and snarling dogs. He had watched friends get locked up for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. That was when he decided to become a lawyer. For over 40 years, he had defended innocent black men from fabricated charges, corrupt police, and a legal system designed to swallow them whole. He knew every dirty trick in the book because he had fought against them in court and won. But tonight, he was not standing in a courtroom. He was standing on a cold sidewalk, his body aching from rough hands, his groceries scattered like debris from a storm, and the two officers towering over him. They had no idea who they had just put their hands on, the call he had just made. It was to Chief Darrell Johnson, the city's first black police chief, and not just any chief. A man Elijah had mentored. The officers were still rifling through Elijah's car, still smirking as though they had all the power. But then, sirens. Louder, closer, multiple units. Deputy Carter's head snapped up. "What the hell?" The officers exchanged a glance, their smirks faltering as two more police cruisers pulled up. And then, the moment Elijah had been waiting for, the driver's side door of the lead car opened, and Chief Darrell Johnson stepped out. The shift in the air was immediate. Chief Johnson's presence alone commanded authority, but it was his face, set like stone, dark eyes scanning the scene, that sent a chill through the two officers. "What the hell is going on here?" Johnson demanded, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. Deputy Carter straightened, suddenly all business. "Sir, we were just conducting a routine stop." "A routine stop?" Chief Johnson's eyes flickered to Elijah, who was standing tall and unshaken despite the bruising grip marks on his arms. "What probable cause did you have to pull over this man?" Officer Blake scoffed. "Come on, Chief." The guy looked suspicious. Johnson's jaw tightened. He turned to Elijah. "Mr. Carter, are you all right?" "I will be," Elijah said, his voice smooth but firm. He gestured toward the bystanders, one of whom was still filming every second of this encounter. "But I am not the only one who saw what happened here." Deputy Carter's face paled. He looked around, the growing crowd, the flashing lights, the phone cameras capturing every detail. Chief Johnson turned back to his officers. "Hand me your body cam footage, now." The officers hesitated, but they knew they were trapped. Elijah stood in silence, watching. For years, he had fought for justice from inside the courtroom. But tonight, justice had come to meet him on the street. The silence between Chief Johnson and his officers stretched unbearably. The flashing lights painted their faces in rhythmic streaks of red and blue, but no amount of color could hide the fear creeping into the officers' eyes. Elijah stood tall, watching as the weight of accountability settled on the men who had violated his rights. Chief Johnson held out his hand again. "I said, hand me your body cam footage, right now." Deputy Carter and Officer Blake hesitated, a moment too long, and that was all the confirmation the chief needed. "Sergeant," Johnson called over his shoulder, "retrieve their footage, now." A female officer stepped forward, her expression unreadable, but her posture told Elijah everything. This was protocol, but it was also a test. A test of who, in this moment, would stand on the right side of history. Deputy Carter's lips tightened, his fingers lingering over the release latch of his body cam. He wanted to resist. He wanted to keep control, but control had already slipped from his grasp. With an almost defeated sigh, he unhooked the device and handed it over. Officer Blake did the same, his jaw clenched so tightly Elijah thought it might shatter. Chief Johnson inspected the devices briefly before turning back to Elijah. "Mr. Carter, if you are willing, I would like you to come to the station and file an official complaint. This footage, along with the witness recordings, will be part of our internal investigation." Elijah met the chief's gaze. He saw something there. Not just authority, not just duty. He saw a man who wanted to do the right thing. "I will be there first thing in the morning," Elijah said. His voice was calm but unyielding. "And I will make sure this does not get swept under the rug." The chief nodded. "It will not." And that was when the unexpected happened. One of the bystanders, the woman who had been filming from the sidewalk, stepped forward. "I saw everything," she said, holding up her phone. "I got it all on video." The officers flinched, but it was too late. Their fate was sealed. Elijah turned to the young woman. "What is your name?" "Trina," she answered, her voice unwavering. "Trina," Elijah said, nodding. "You just helped change the course of history tonight." Trina straightened, realizing the weight of her actions. She had done what so many had been afraid to do. Bear witness. Speak up. Demand justice. As the chief ordered the two officers to return to the precinct for immediate questioning, Elijah let out a slow breath. For the first time that night, he felt something unexpected. Hope. By the next morning, the entire city was watching. The video of Elijah's unlawful stop had gone viral overnight. News outlets picked it up, social media erupted, and community leaders called for swift action. Outside the police precinct, protesters gathered. Some held signs demanding justice, others chanted Elijah's name. The pressure was mounting, and the police department had no choice but to respond. Inside, Elijah Carter sat across from Chief Johnson in a dimly lit conference room. The body cam footage had been reviewed, analyzed, and confirmed every detail. The officers had no just cause to stop him, no legal reason to search his vehicle, and their treatment of him was not only unethical, it was criminal. A disciplinary board hearing was scheduled immediately. Elijah insisted on being there. He would look these men in the eyes as their fates were decided. The hearing room was tense. Deputy Carter and Officer Blake sat stiffly at a long table, their lawyer beside them, whispering hurried instructions. Across from them sat Elijah, his presence alone a statement. The video was played for the room, and with every second, the officers seemed to shrink further into their chairs. Then Chief Johnson spoke. "Deputy Carter, Officer Blake, your actions on the night of this incident were unlawful, unethical, and in direct violation of department policy. You disregarded proper procedure, violated Mr. Carter's civil rights, and engaged in conduct unbecoming of officers of this department." Neither officer spoke. They had nothing to say. Chief Johnson continued. "Effective immediately, you are both terminated from the force." The silence in the room was deafening. Elijah watched as the reality sank in for the two disgraced officers. They had believed they were untouchable. But today, justice had touched them. The moment the decision was announced, the protests outside erupted into cheers. The people had won, not just Elijah, but the entire community. But the fight was not over. As the officers were escorted out, Elijah stood, leaning on the table slightly for support. He was tired, but he was not done. "We need more than just firings," he said, looking straight at Chief Johnson. "We need real change." Chief Johnson met his gaze and nodded. "Then let's make it happen." And just like that, a new battle began. Elijah Carter stepped outside the precinct, the crisp morning air filling his lungs, as a wave of applause erupted from the gathered crowd. People of all ages and backgrounds had come together, chanting his name, holding signs that demanded justice, not just for him, but for every black man and woman who had ever been harassed, silenced, or dehumanized. Elijah had seen many battles in his lifetime. He had fought in courtrooms, stood on protest lines, and buried too many friends who never got the justice they deserved. But today felt different. A reporter rushed forward, microphone in hand. "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to know those officers have been fired?" Elijah looked out at the crowd, at the hope in their eyes. "It is not just about those two officers," he said, his voice steady. "It is about a system that has allowed this to happen over and over again. This is a victory, but we cannot stop here." His words sent murmurs through the crowd. He was right. The people wanted more than firings. They wanted real systemic change. And the wheels were already turning. Within a week, the City Council held an emergency meeting. New policies were introduced. Escalation mandatory racial bias training for all officers, independent oversight committees to review misconduct cases, a zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling. The police union fought back, but the pressure was too strong. The people were watching now, holding them accountable. And Elijah, he was at the center of it all. His story had ignited something, a movement. Calls flooded in from civil rights organizations, lawyers, even young activists who wanted to learn from him. "How do we keep this momentum going?" they asked. And Elijah knew exactly how. He partnered with Trina, the young woman who had filmed everything, and together they launched a legal defense fund for victims of police brutality. They held Know Your Rights workshops, equipping the next generation with the tools to fight back. Not with violence, but with knowledge and power. Meanwhile, the two disgraced officers, Deputy Carter and Officer Blake, found themselves blacklisted from law enforcement. Without a badge to hide behind, they faced a civil lawsuit from Elijah Carter himself, and this time, they were on the other side of the courtroom. The evidence was undeniable. The city settled for an undisclosed amount, but Elijah did not keep a penny. Instead, he used the money to fund scholarships for black law students, ensuring there would be more lawyers to fight the battles he had spent his life waging. Months later, Elijah stood before a packed auditorium, a guest speaker at a law school he had helped fund. His voice was firm, but full of wisdom. "This is not just my story," he told them. "This is our story. Every time we demand justice, every time we refuse to back down, we change the world, one case at a time." The audience rose to their feet, applauding not just a man, but a movement. And as Elijah looked out at the sea of young faces, ready to carry the torch forward, he knew his fight had not been in vain. The system had tried to break him. Instead, he had broken the system. Do you think justice was truly served? Let us talk in the comments.